Hello, everyone. It's Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, I have with me an awesome guest and an awesome interview for today. Let's kill that part. An awesome interview for today. Um, I have Margaret Kimberley, editor and senior columnist at the Black Agenda Report and committee member for Black Agenda for Peace. Margaret, please say hello to the audience.
Hello, and thank you so much. It's Black
Um,
Alliance for Peace.
Black Alliance for Peace. Did I say that right?
You do
Oh,
what I do. I often confuse agenda and alliance. Yes, but Black Alliance for Peace.
okay. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Um, so you're here with me. I'm just checking my levels and make sure the volume and everything else is good. Uh, Perfect. So I was contacted by a member of Black Alliance for Peace. Am I saying that right? Black Alliance for Peace, right?
Yes, BAP. You can say BAP for short.
Okay, BAPS for sure. Um, about an initiative that you guys were starting called Get Out of Africa, essentially get the United States out of Africa. Before we get to that point, I kind of want to step through just to establish a few things. Now, what is BAP? I guess BAP works on both ends, but what is the organization?
Black Alliance for Peace was founded on April 4th, 2017. And that date is a very significant one. That was the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's speech at the Riverside Church in New York City, where he broke with the Johnson administration on the issue of the Vietnam War.
Yes.
Exactly 1 year later, 1968, was the date of his assassination. And he was assassinated, I believe, and others, in large part because he had taken this anti-war stance. In the face of terrible criticism, everybody loves him now.
Yeah.
He was vilified by the New York Times, by the Washington Post, by the networks, by some people in the SCLC, including his own father and friends who said, this is not the time. Johnson is our friend. You don't want to tick him off. But he courageously did the right thing and was consistently anti-war from that day forward. And so that date was chosen for the founding of Black Alliance for Peace. We are a people-centered, Black-led movement. We believe that it is very important to recapture that anti-war polity that until fairly recently, that was always consistent among our people. Black people have always been the most anti-war, the most left-leaning, but the Democratic Party has gone to the right. Obama being president moved us further to the right. But Black Alliance for Peace is committed to reestablishing that position that we have always had. And we began last year in October. I can't believe I'm saying last year already, even though it was a few months ago. October 1st, we began our campaign to end Africom and get the United States out of the African continent and end U.S. Military role in any African nation.
I'm glad you mentioned the Martin Luther King thing. Like you said, people try to associate themselves with this behavior now, like, oh, we love King. They hug him like nobody's business.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that wasn't when Martin Luther King stepped out of the Vietnam. People were like, why is this Negro talking about these war issues? He's supposed to be dealing with the issues of blacks in America. Um, what was King's reasoning for this? I mean, I'm doing an interview, and people always chide me that you never let your interview person or your interview talk. What was his reason for this, and was this necessary to understand now? Meaning, the reason why King stepped out from the standpoint of war, and how he connected the issues of war and imperialism abroad to the subjugation of African Americans here in the United States.
Well, part of it was just very practical and obvious. You cannot spend a lot of money on the military and take care of your people. The needs of people in this country cannot be met. Today, the defense budget is 60% of the budget.
Yeah.
So any talk of, and this is something that is a critique of Bernie Sanders and others who they may have domestic policies that we are in favor of and want to see enacted, but you cannot have Medicare for all, you can't have free college, you can't build the infrastructure, you can't give money to public education, you can't do anything to help people as long as the budget, the military sucks up so much of our money. And King knew this. He could not say that the government should do more for its people, that we ought to have a democratic society if you always also had this war on the other side of the world, which sucked up millions of dollars. He was also a person, excuse me, he was always an internationalist. He was also always someone who worked for the care of humanity, and warfare is the exact opposite. We're
Yeah.
talking about terrorism. He said the United States was the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, and here we are 50 years later, and it's still true. So
Yeah.
he said he couldn't care about people in this country, but be indifferent to the plight of people in Vietnam who only wanted to be able to practice self-determination and choose the government that they wanted. That was all they wanted. And for the United States to claim a right to invade their country and kill millions of people was wrong. And he said as much very clearly.
Yeah. Yeah. It's there's a conversation between McNamara, and I think it's Ho Chi Minh just before he they could pass, and McNamara was shocked to find out that they just wanted self determination. Like, the United States coded as if this was communist takeover of Vietnam, and that wasn't it in the least. They just wanted, the ability to choose their own government in this sense, making this point that, if liberal democracy allowed France to take over our country, then we don't necessarily want liberal democracy. It was the example that they set, which was the thing that showed, pushed them in a different direction. That always blew me away to hear that speech for King in Vietnam, at a time where African Americans were finally making inroads into a political process, and he was able to make the I guess the connection between those things, and still having the moral fortitude to be able to back away from it and go after him for this kind of war policy. I love that speech. That is amazing.
Yeah.
So what is Africom? Explain Africom.
Africom is the U.S. Africa Command. Unbeknownst to most people, the United States has taken it upon itself to divide up the world into various commands. There's a Northcom and a Southcom. And on October 1st, 2008, in the last few months of George W. Bush's administration, they created Africom, the U.S. Africa Command, which is actually headquartered in Germany, which tells you how popular the idea was. Still is in Stuttgart, Germany. And in that time, mostly obviously during the Obama administration and continuing into the Trump administration, the United States has quite literally taken over the militaries of most African countries. There are only 2 countries on the continent that do not have a connection with Africom. So there are U.S. troops on the ground in many countries. We found out in Niger when those 4 soldiers were killed towards the end of 2017. There are drone bases in Africa. So you have a new kind of colonialism where African countries cannot, obviously, as we were just talking about self-determination, people in these nations can't do what they want if they have military control of their countries by the United States. And officers in these various nations are trained by the US, and there's also a military presence. And this is very dangerous for African people who still struggle to find true independence. Decades after their countries became nominally independent from European colonial nations, mostly Britain and France, but others as well, Portugal. And but they're not independent. They cannot be independent if they are under the military control of the U.S. And that means the U.S. gets to do what it wants to do, and have control of African resources, have control of African politics. So that is a short description of what Africom is.
You know, when I was in Kenya, I was in two African nations, Kenya and Egypt, on the last trip. One of the gentlemen that I ended up interviewing kind of made it very clear that his friends, who was trained by U.S. soldiers, Kenyan, he said they were trained by U.S. soldiers. He said there's a U.S. African base or recruitment center. He says I could take you there. He says I have pictures of him essentially being in conflict with U.S. soldiers and trained with U.S. soldiers, and I'm floored by this. Like I knew that the United States was in the various African nations. I didn't know how integrated the United States was with those nations. He made this point that he says, my friend was doing very grisly things. He said the people who are getting in knowing that they're doing grisly things. He said the poverty in those countries propel people to be willing to accept that military role. It's like, if you need to feed your family, you need to feed your family. What are you going to do? Let your kids starve, or are you going to do something grisly in order to feed them?
Sure.
And, you know, this wasn't something that he necessarily liked. Like this wasn't a popular position. In fact, it was so unpopular that it was causing political upheaval in the country itself. I was amazed by this. Like I don't think most Americans know how integrated the United States is into the various militaries of the nations around the world.
Oh, sure. Well, the United States has military bases and other facilities in more than 100 countries. Depending on how you count these facilities, it's somewhere between 800 and 1,000 bases and various facilities that the U.S. has around the world. So Africa is actually a small piece of a bigger puzzle of U.S. efforts to literally control as much of the world as it possibly can. And it's something that is not discussed enough, but there are groups, excuse me, Black Alliance for Peace is one of many groups. We're part of a larger coalition. And there was a recent international conference in Dublin, which I was fortunate enough to attend, international conference against U.S. NATO military bases. Excuse me. And NATO is a bigger part of this puzzle. It's not just the United States, but it's NATO partners who have these facilities all over the world, and therefore restrict the rights to self-determination of all these countries. And, you know, in comparison, Russia has bases in outside of Russia in only 9 countries.
Yeah.
That's it. So more than 109. So we can see who's really practicing imperialism, and that's a word that people think of as being old-fashioned, but it should not be. That's exactly what we're talking about. If you have military control and military bases, you control what people can and cannot do, and what they can and cannot even talk about or vote for. So Black Alliance for Peace is we're happy to be part of these larger coalitions who fight against these same forces.
Now, the organization or the initiative that's being put out, this United States out of Africa, what are the objectives? What are I know the basic objective is, you know, get out, leave Africa to its own devices. But there were specific demands.
Mm-hmm.
What were the demands that were associated with the organization?
Well, people can see we have a petition, and you can find out. Look at my cheat sheet.
The link's at the bottom. I have the link at the bottom of the video.
Okay, tinyurl.com/shutdown Africom. Our petition is in 6 different languages: English, French, Spanish, German, Vietnamese, and Arabic. I think I got all 6. And it's a very clear statement that the U.S. should get out of Africa. We're also making a demand specifically to the Congressional Black Caucus to take the lead on this issue, to hold hearings. And as where everyone's bragging about the Democrats now having control of the House of Representatives, let's see what that really means. So we are calling on the CBC to hold hearings, to take the lead in making this demand that the U.S. leave Africa. And it's part of, the connection is larger. Your viewers may know about the 1033 program, which brings spare U.S. Defense Department equipment and gives it to police departments.
Yeah, that's insane. That's utterly insane. You would have these little towns with tanks. It's just like...
Yes, absolutely. And unfortunately, most CBC members voted to expand this program. And it expanded the most when Obama was president. We want an end to the 1033 program. We want an end to Africom. And we need to have a larger discussion about the role of the US abroad, about our tacit acceptance of this and what it does to us here. And as King told us 50 years ago, we cannot have a truly democratic country when our nation practices imperialism. We will end up with military vehicles in Podunk, USA.
Yeah.
We will end up with death across the world. We will end up with the military sucking all the money out of the budget and crumbling infrastructure and crumbling schools and people in debt and no healthcare, so on and so on. All of these things, all of our needs could be taken care of if we didn't have this huge military budget. There's enough money in the Treasury to take care of all the human needs that people have in this country. But we cannot talk about wanting those things if we do not also talk about international issues, if we do not also talk about Africom and other means of the United States practicing imperialism abroad. We cannot have a real democracy. We cannot have people who have we can't have an expectation that our needs will be met if we also accept this bloated military budget. And by the way, Trump asked for a 10% increase in the military budget, a number he pulled out of thin air. And Democrats gave him more than what he asked for. The U.S. military budget totals that of the 6 or 7 other countries. It's equal
combined.
To yes, yeah. China and France and UK and Russia and Saudi Arabia. If you combine all of their military budgets, it equals that of the U.S. So, people say that, as you pointed out, many of the criticisms of King was, why is he talking about stuff outside of this country? We have to talk about things outside of the country because that determines what can and can't be done inside the country.
We could cut our military budget in half and still be twice as much as the next largest country.
Yes.
Like it's obscene. 2 items. Mm-hmm. So the first one has to do with oh geez, it slipped from my mind as soon as I said it. So I'll move to the second item. The first item will come back up. China.
Yes.
Now, when I was over there, one of the things that kept coming up was China. It was everywhere, even in the casinos. You see Chinese gambling, like hardcore gamblers, in the casinos. But the casinos, some of them, adjusted itself in order to make a habitable space for them. Now, I bring this up because it gives you this influence of China in the African region. There were even newspapers that kind of made this point of, with the imperialism of Europe, they left us in a vulnerable state for Chinese to essentially ingratiate itself economically into the country. You can't be there without seeing the influence of China in Africa. It is an amazing thing. Part of, I would argue that this Africom thing, it's not just, you're right, imperialism, but it goes, oh, I know what it was. It's darker than what you're saying. So yes, the military budget takes up almost half of our discretionary spending, but It gets worse than that, because it's like, how do you have a democracy when the overwhelming majority of the budget is black? Meaning, when they looked at, it just says this thing to a random office, but the actual amount that these random offices are spending is somewhat unknown. What they're spending it on is unknown. You only have a very few members of Congress that are even privy to what these black budget stuff is. Like, it's darker than that. In Chalmers Johnson's book, I think it was Blowback, he makes that point pretty clearly, where he goes through the expenditures and he realizes, you don't know what these are. Like, these kind of go into departments, and there's this kind of weird quasi-government private thing, but the public itself, and even most of the congressional members, don't know. Like, I find that to be a fascinating thing. How do you have a democracy when you can't even, vote on those issues?
Right. Well, wasn't it recently revealed that there was $1 trillion missing from the Defense Department that's unaccounted for? Nobody knows how it was spent or where it went. I mean, that's absolutely disgraceful. But if you ever talk about doing anything that helps people, what's the first thing you hear?
How do we pay for it?
How do you pay for that? You can't pay for free college. You can't pay for anything that helps people. Meanwhile, there's $1 trillion that's nobody knows where it went. So it is inherently undemocratic, and it will only get worse if we don't speak to it. And as the 2020 presidential election has already started, Elizabeth Warren was the first to make the official announcement, and she's one of these people with a liberal reputation, but she's not willing to talk about what the military budget does to people and how it hamstrings the government and basically makes a determination that you're not getting anything you need. If we're going to have the military taking up that much money, you're not getting anything you need. So it's pie in the sky. So if you really want it, you have to also talk about military spending and the U.S. bases in Africa and around the world.
Part of the problem is that the military has become a jobs program. If congressional members want to end military spending, that may mean closing a base in their particular district. I live here in Richmond. Norfolk is like a major military base. If you're talking about cutting the military budget in half, what's going to happen to those jobs? And I suspect that part of the logistics that congressional members come up, it's a gross way of trying to create, jobs and everything else. And that money is going into people's pockets. I would say it's only being filtered down to other people who work in those areas. But congressional members have to deal with that. I think that's part of the logic that some of these members go with, missing the point that you can invest that money at home and still get that same benefit of a jobs boost. I mean,
we could create different jobs.
Yeah.
Who says the jobs have to be in the military?
Oh, I agree.
But we're told this constantly. There's always some reason why you can't touch the military budget. Yeah. People will lose jobs. Of course, you could create jobs somewhere else. But these defense contractors, they lobby Congress constantly.
Yes.
I was in Washington briefly this past weekend, and it's very strange to see these advertisements in the metro system for Raytheon and for Boeing and this propaganda. There's no other word for it.
Yeah.
Says that the business of America is war. So you have these defense contractors making billions of dollars, pretending to be the sole source of employment in the country.
Yeah.
Also, in the U.S. military, I believe, is the biggest polluter in the world, and it's obvious. You can't have aircraft carriers and military bases and not use a lot of fossil fuels and dispose of fossil fuels. But that is excluded, by the way, from these climate agreements, these climate accords. They have these goals of reducing fossil fuel usage, but it excludes the military, which makes it pretty farcical. One of many reasons that they are. But I also want to get back to Africa.
Yes.
because since we began our U.S. out of Africa campaign on October 1st, John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, gave a speech in December, just a few weeks ago, about China. Excuse me. And basically, he warned African countries to end their relations with China. Now,
Yeah,
as
right.
you point out, China has more money than it can spend. Apparently, I think that's a way of describing it. And China has moved into Africa. The relationships they're positives and negatives. Chinese companies make a lot of money. They insist that their companies move into Africa. Sometimes their people are employed instead of local people. So there are problems involved with it. But they are also forgiving debt, unlike the IMF, unlike the World Bank, which insist on austerity for African countries in order to get any help. China has helped out many African economies in that way. They are building roads, building bridges, building railroad systems, and I would say it's a net benefit, frankly. And of course, the U.S. realizes this. So Bolton gives this speech at the Heritage Foundation and warns China to stay out of Africa, and says that you Africans don't know what you're doing, and this help from China comes with strings attached, and the United States will help you, but you got to do what we want. I mean, it was just absurd, but at the same time, it shows us how the United States sees the rest of the world. China is a competitor. China is set to become the world's largest economy, and by moving into Africa economically, will of course be a rival politically for the United States, and that was the impetus for this bizarre speech,
Speech.
which implied that Africans don't know what they're doing and aren't smart enough to know who their friends are. But and there's a statement on the Black Alliance for Peace website about Bolton's speech. So it tells you why Africom needs to end. The U.S. has nothing to offer Africa except more militarism, which is the last thing African countries need, is more war, more death. And the same thing happens to their countries. If they are spending money on their militaries, they're not taking care of the needs of their people. They cannot practice self-determination if you have governments that are under the military control of the United States. So we can see why Bolton felt the need to make this statement, but it also reaffirms our commitment for the U.S. to get out of Africa.
Yeah, it's disturbing. I mean, there's an odd, like you said, quasi-military economic thing that's going on where, like you said, China has started to ingratiate itself into Africa, and the United States, with military might in Africa, take steps in order to try to hedge off the fact that China is, going in economically. Yeah, that's an odd way. I remember one of the things that came up when I was over there was talking about a military base that China was going to open in Africa. Now, a military base makes all the sense in the world from a logical standpoint. You want to protect your economic gains within the country itself. The catch with this is it puts you head to head with the United States military that is also in that country. Yeah, what's taking place in Africa is fascinating right now. And I totally get and agree with the aims of, look, you've instantiated yourself in the countries, in these areas, because you want to have this kind of global dominance. And this is a new style of colonialism that may not look exactly like the British system. But let's be honest, it is still a form of control over those particular countries. So yes, I firmly agree with this. Is there?
Well, the African nations should be free to ally themselves with whomever they want.
Agreed.
And if the world would be very different if the U.S. and NATO nations got out of the way and let people figure out for themselves what what
Let me
they.
ask you this: why do the countries agree? So I can understand. I know there's pressure that the United States puts on the various countries, even in Ecuador. Just as something as basic as they were making a determination on breast milk being the best thing, and the United States was against this and was pressuring Ecuador to not sign on to that particular measure. Like it was some insane stuff where they were putting pressure on this. Like, are you really putting pressure on this? You know, it's understood that way, but they were doing it to some degree to benefit the cereal companies
Right.
who didn't want them to say that because it adversely affects their profits. So I understand that the U.S. puts pressure on these various nations, but like you made a point early on that only two nations in Africa does not have some kind of military agreement with the United States. That is amazing. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's these countries have been made vulnerable. The colonialism technically ended in the 60s as the British and the French uh, gave, well, people struggled for independence. I
Yeah.
don't want to say they were given independence. And they made the decision to officially end colonialism, but there is financial control over these countries. France, in particular, African countries, their currency, the former French colonies, their currency is controlled by France. They are under tremendous pressure from their former colonial overlords, and the U.S. comes in with guns. So, for example, we could talk about this. I have a segment just about Congo, for example. But the U.S. gives millions of dollars to Uganda, to Rwanda, and they invaded Eastern Congo and killed 6 million people. Why? To get resources, to get coltan in particular, a mineral that's used in electronics,
Yeah.
everything that we use. So this is why African nations are vulnerable. And when leaders do emerge who want independence for their nations, they're killed. They're undermined in a variety of ways. So Africa has been deliberately kept vulnerable by the U.S. and other NATO nations. So they accept these agreements because I believe, feel powerless. So the United States comes in and says, we're going to build a base. We're going to get jobs, as we just talked about. So there's an argument that this is, a jobs program for people in country X. And without any other kind of support, there's a temptation to
Yes.
accept it, especially when the leadership in these countries go along with it, and you don't have democratic nations where people have a voice. Although I hasten to add, we don't have a democratic nation where people have a voice. So when people at the top accept these arrangements and these agreements, um, uh, people who may not want that don't really have a voice, and so it just continues this cycle of colonialism, continues this cycle of enforced dependency.
Is there anything that I haven't asked that you would like to articulate before we end?
Yes, I'd like to repeat, people should sign our petition, tinyurl.com/shutdown Africom. And in case I got that wrong, you can go to change.org and you can search for Africom, and you can find the petition. You can also find it on the Black Alliance for Peace website. I urge your viewers to take a look at our website and find out how they can be involved. We're establishing groups in cities across the country, and we are looking for people. We know that there are people who want to be active, who want to find new ways to impact the political system, and we are an important part of that. So we look forward to our uh, um, request to the Congressional Black Caucus, and it'll be very interesting to see how they respond, not just to us as an organization, but respond to the needs of their constituents. Their constituents need the United States to get out of Africa, need the United States to cut its military budget, and need them to take a leadership role in carrying out what will work best for their people.
Are you optimistic that the Congressional Black Caucus is going to engage in this? I've become cynical of politics.
Okay.
And in becoming somewhat cynical of the behavior of the people who are in the political space, I am inclined to believe that race is subordinate to class. Like, so people having a particular racial identity doesn't necessarily correspond to what those people do. And, you know, making the point that the Republican Party, yes, is predominantly white, but those white people are being screwed over by the Republican Party. Like, the fact that they're of the same race doesn't necessarily stop them from being indifferent to the plight of their own. I guess I feel that way about the Congressional Black Caucus also. Am I wrong to think that way?
No, you're not wrong, but I think it's important to, and I never tell anybody they're wrong to be cynical, because especially when you're talking about politics, you're more likely to be right if you're being cynical. But I think we need to remember that it's the movement from the bottom up. It's the movement, the demands of the masses of people that bring change to the country. And because you are right about our political leadership, that tells us there's a need for the people to speak up and a need for us to make demands and engage with them, because nothing will change. Definitely nothing will change if they don't hear from us. So this is something we have to do.
One last question. I'm sorry, I lied about saying it was the last question before. Sometimes these questions come up as I'm thinking about them. When I was abroad, I was having a conversation with a woman from Kenya, and you know, their living standard is far different than ours. It's a much poorer country, even though Nairobi looks like any other city that you go to. And in having this conversation, she's talking about our Americans, and she says, you know, nothing changes because you guys are comfortable. I don't necessarily think that's fully true in the sense of comfort. I look at other nations, and from the standpoint of the standards of Europe, the United States almost looks like a third world country in some respects. You know, if you're talking about infrastructure, you're talking about wages, even if you're talking about government services, things that the community itself comes together and say, we want to provide X and to make sure that this relationship doesn't take place. France right now is flipping out. Mm-hmm. If the United States had anywhere near the social services of France, you know, it's a mind-blowing thing, the prospect. What is it? Is it comfort? Is it something else? What is it, the thing that keeps the people in this country from being more vocal about things that should change? Like, the war thing is a big deal. Like, the amount of resources that it sucks into the country. And you have areas of the country that don't have clean water. You have people who are living on the streets. What is it that keeps this country from, let's say, exhibiting the behavior of France or the Yellow Vest movement, when, in all honesty, it should be doing those things? Like, Occupy Wall Street was a good example. What am I missing? What's that thing? What's the thing? Because you're right, nothing changes without push from below.
Yeah, I think we can never forget that the liberation movement of the 60s and early 70s was crushed. It was deliberately crushed by the counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO, by the assassination of King, and people being literally killed off, being made political prisoners. So I think it's important to remember there was a war against these movements because they were successful. So that's something that we can never forget. The explosion of the prison population was a way to kill off the movement. When I wrote an article about King earlier this year, the anniversary of his 50th anniversary of his assassination. When King was alive, there were only 300,000 people incarcerated in the entire country. There are now more than 2 million. It's a sevenfold increase. And that's how you destroy a movement. If you if you put Black people in jail, particularly young men in prison, that destroys it destroys people politically, financially, destroys family life. So we can't underestimate the degree to which our movement was deliberately attacked and destroyed. The people in control, they're not stupid. So they see that people are protesting, and they find ways to buy people off, and they open the gates a little bit, let some people through. That decreased the pressure, decreased the demands, because legal segregation ended, and that did help some of us. It helped enough of us to take the pressure off. The political process moved further and further and further to the right. And the Democratic Party, which used to be the party of the people, the party that was in favor of equality and justice, has moved further to the right along with it. So we have a far-right party and a center-right party controlling our politics. The Occupy movement was very important. It showed how much people want change. They took Occupy out, and this leaderless movement thing, I don't think that was a good idea.
No, it wasn't. It was not.
So I think that was one of the things that helped it to disappear.
Yeah.
Then you have people like, and as I say again, they're not stupid. They don't just sit around waiting to be destroyed. So they get somebody like Obama, who puts a pretty face on imperialism and says the right things. But he was the Wall Street candidate.
Yeah.
So he was the candidate of people who claim to be on the left, and the candidate of Goldman Sachs at the same time. So I don't think we can underestimate the degree to which there's constant pressure on us not to do these things. And, and in general, Americans don't have a lot of class consciousness. So you see people struggling here who identify with the people who oppress them. That's peculiar American. But I think we can learn from people in other parts of the world. And France, people are protesting because France is becoming more like the United States.
Yeah.
Macron and some of his predecessors have little by little whittled away at their social safety net, which was much stronger. They are privatizing part of their healthcare system. The EU membership creates incentives for businesses to relocate to lower wage EU countries like Poland, let's say. Yeah. So if a manufacturing entity moves to Poland, well, then that's a loss of living wage jobs for people in France who used to have them. But we fight against this by moving to the left. There's so much talk about, so much misuse of words like fascism and socialism, and you fight fascism very simply by taking care of people's needs. That's how you fight fascism. And true socialism, it's unfortunate that people who are just Democrats have been allowed to call themselves socialists. We talk about socialism, public ownership of the means of production. That's what we need to talk about. So Bernie Sanders is not a socialist. Ocasio-Cortez is not a socialist. They're just Democrats. And it's very unfortunate and dangerous for us to allow that word to be used so incorrectly. But that's why we're here, to talk about these things and encourage people to start speaking out. And they know that people want something different. And that's why, someone, we were talking about Richard Wolff and how you got so many more views, because there are people who know the system doesn't work for them. So it's difficult in this country. We do have we got a harder job here. But anyway, we're going to move on.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And look, I think that what it's called revolutionary potential is there. I mean, I don't necessarily think the people who were part of Occupy Wall Street just vanished. The leaderless thing is bizarre.
Yeah.
When you want to get something done, you need to figure it. This, and I understand that they wanted to have this kind of decentralized structure and all this other. If you want to get something done, there needs to be somebody who's there, whose sole job is it to get those things done. Yeah. I think we talked about King. I think King was a good example of this. Yes, they wanted lefty stuff, but they also needed to know when they needed to fall in line in order to get those things accomplished.
Yeah. And also we need to talk about these things. We can learn from. There's still people around from those days in the 60s and 70s who can talk about their experience and tell us what we can do differently. And there's going to be struggle and debate. We can't be afraid of that.
Yeah.
In order to come up with plans to move forward and know what actions to take next.
Margaret, Kimberley, thank you very much for coming on to the Soapbox.
Thank you so much for having me.
All the links are below if anyone wants to sign the petition and get more information about essentially get America out of Africa and shut down Africom. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, guys, if you enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support the PayPal or Patreon. Thanks all.